Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks for having me. And again, John Gaut, master beekeeper, certified a few years ago. That picture there was drawn by my daughter. The idea was that I live up by the Rampo River, and it was supposed to be a river of honey, and there's bears up there, and the bear was going to be dipping out honey from the river. Whenever I drew it, though, it looked like a donkey sitting on its butt, and she made it look a lot better. So tonight we're going to talk about backyard queen rearing, focus on that and not so much the commercial aspects of it. I'll go through my background a little bit. We'll talk about why you want to raise your own queens. Whether you're raising queens in your backyard or commercially, whether it's 3 or 30 or 300, the biology is all the same. So we'll cover a lot of queen bee biology. There's a lot of bee biology in general. We'll kind of focus on queen bee biology. I'll go through various queen rearing methods that are out there, and you can kind of pick and choose what you think makes sense to you. There's a process. Queens are on a schedule, so you need to understand what the process is and what that schedule is to be successful. I have a little bit here about introducing a queen cell to a colony, to a mating nuke, introducing a mated queen. I also have here, and I wanted to talk about overwintering nukes because we're at the time now where if you raise your queens, you can put them in a nuke and maybe overwinter them that way. And I can't talk about queens without talking about colony swarming and do I need a queen, because it's just about every day I get a call and it's saying my colony's queenless. Do you have any queens? Well, earlier today I talked myself out of another sale because the guy wasn't sure if he had a queen or not, and I'm pretty sure he did. And I've got a lot of information here. If we have time, we'll go through myth busting, beekeeping myth busting. This will be the queen edition. So with that, my background, I started when I was 9 years old, maybe 10. I can't remember exactly. I'm pretty sure it was 9 because there's 2 houses on the farm and we were living in the one house. Whenever I was 10, we moved to the big house. And I had a hive there, and I would stand beside the hive and watch the bees come and go when I was 9 years old. I could still picture myself and the bees doing that. On the farm, I had 12 to 14 hives. I had them set up behind what was called the corn crib. It was a nice location for them. It was wind protected, and they did well. There was a lot of alfalfa growing on the farm to feed the cattle, so that was a good nectar source. The bees were able to produce some comb honey. I didn't start producing comb honey until I was maybe more like 14, 15, 16, and because that's a whole another challenge, but people love the comb honey. I made the comb honey in basswood boxes, which you rarely see today. I remember having to put the basswood boxes together and breaking a few of them while I'm putting them together. It's if you ever have a chance to put your hands on some basswood comb boxes, they're pretty interesting. Back then, American foul brood and European foul brood were the main concerns. Fortunately, I never had American foul brood. European foul brood was around. I did treat them with terramycin, but probably treated them ineffectively. Back then, the way you treated for a European foul brood, there was a tab of terramycin. You mixed it in sugar syrup and you fed it to the bees that way. That was the way it was prescribed. Since then, people found out that the terramycin is pretty much ineffective whenever you mix it in a sugar solution like that. And as Landy said, I became a master beekeeper through the Eastern Apiculture Society. So backyard queen rearing. Queen rearing itself, let's see, I think I got a couple questions here, right? First question. So who has raised their own queens? A few people. Probably more of you can put up your hand than that, really, because your colonies have raised their own queens themselves too, maybe with a little help, so that's good. Next question. What's the difference between backyard queen rearing and commercial queen rearing? So I don't have an answer for this. What is your answers?
The number of queens.
Numbers of queens, okay.
And if you sell them.
Yeah, okay, if you're selling them. What else is different?
Aren't the commercial people like pure play, like that's all they do is queens, basically? They're not in the honey?
No. Could be. I mean, probably the commercial people have a subgroup of people that focus on queens, at least for part of the year. And depending on the size of the operation, they may have one or two individuals that are really good at queen rearing, and those individuals will rear queens and then maybe help with honey harvest and other tasks too. But the larger the queen operation, the more people and the more they have focused on the operation, that's for sure. What's another difference? Yes?
Breeding and refining lines?
Say that again?
Breeding and refining lines.
Breeding and refining lines? Yeah, that's very good. I'm not a queen breeder. I'm a queen selector, if you will, and then raise queens from that. Queen breeders will really try to develop a line. What's another? Yes?
Artificial insemination.
Yeah, commercials, but I got to tell you, there's hobbyists that do playing around with artificial instrumental insemination too, but a lot of the, not a lot, there's a few commercial queen rearers, queen producers that do instrumental insemination, but those queens are pretty expensive. How much do you think the instrumental inseminated queens are, Lisa? That used to be able to get them for like $300. They're more north of $500 a queen now.
I bought one this year for $300.
Did you? Okay.
John, I think that when like in backyard queen rearing, you're really helping your colonies raise a queen. But in commercial queen rearing, you're actually specifically raising, a range of like a line of queens, and you have many different concerns, including keep them from killing each other and stuff
Right.
like that.
And I like what you said about you're helping the colony raise a queen. So I think that says a lot about backyard beekeeping, because you're working with the bees to produce a few more queens. Do I have another question? Yeah. And so why would you raise your own queens? Any quick answers to this? I got a whole lot.
You have a good queen and you want her genes, so you.
That's a good answer. Yeah.
Money.
Money? What? Save money?
Saving money?
No, that's a bad answer. Sorry. Insurance. Okay. Just to have a queen available. Okay. So next slide. First one is availability. And we just talked about that. So insurance, you have a queen available. A couple of these we already heard. Next one, Ivan mentioned genetics, and specifically, you're looking for locally adapted genetics. Locally adapted means that the genetics that are there are able to survive the winter and also time their other activities, brood rearing and so forth, to the nectar flow. Also gentle behavior. A lot of queens coming into this area from the south aren't very gentle. I'm not a queen breeder, I select, and my primary selection criteria is gentleness. So locally adapted genetics, there's a whole spectrum of genetics that honeybees have. Queens, this queen may have this set of genetics, this queen may have this set of genetics, and another queen has this set. And this all gets mixed together. You're trying to really select the pool of genetics that work in your local conditions. If you have your own queen, it's a proven queen. You can see her performance. If you're buying a queen through the mail, you don't know what you're getting until you put her in a hive. If you have your own queen, you can see her laying pattern. You can see if she's laying worker brood or drone brood. The queen you get in the mail or from other source probably has just started laying eggs. Commercial queen rearers, typically they're on a very routine schedule. They go through their mating nukes. If they see eggs, they find the queen, pull that queen, and ship it out. Typically, there may or may not be larvae there. They never see the cap brood So they're really not sure if that queen's laying drone eggs only or workers and so forth. Most of the time it is if they're laying in a certain period of time, the queen's mated. But you just don't know with the ones you get through the mail. If you're raising yourself, then you know what you've got. The other thing is the pheromone levels peak in queens, almost a month after they emerge from that cell. That's way after they're shipped and they're in your hive. They're really not fully matured whenever you receive them. Takes about 28 days post-emergence for them to mature. And so I really don't, typically I'll be picking queens and pulling the queens out whenever they have cap brood, and I'm sure they're laying worker brood, and that's right around the 28-day period. And their acceptance is a lot better at that period because they're settled. I started raising queens because I'd get queens that were banked, and banking is okay for a short period. Shipping, I've had queens shipped to me that I'm sure were great whenever they left, but because of temperature stress, they weren't so good by the time I got them. And with the Postal Service and so forth, I remember I got queens and they were supposed to be there one day. They didn't show up until 2 days later. Well, I'm pretty sure, and that was hot weather, just kind of like we're having now. So those queens are under a lot of heat stress. And heat stress on queens will reduce the viability of their sperm in the spermatheca. That's been, proven over and over again. Talked about preserving good genetics and saving money and time. I don't find that to be true. I really don't. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of time, and there is money involved because you've got these mating nukes. Up until now, the mating nukes kind of took care of themselves, but from here on, I'm going to have to feed some mating nukes, kind of thing, and that's going to cost some money. So I don't really look at it as saving money, to tell you the truth, but it is fun and rewarding. That's definitely true. All right. Patty, you're doing a good job. I didn't even have to say click. Queen rearing biology. So some basics on queen rearing biology. Queen rearing is easiest in the swarming season. I mean, that's the natural time the queens or the colony wants to raise a queen because they're going to swarm. They're looking to make a replacement queen. So another point, a fertilized egg can become a worker or a queen. What's the difference? The only difference really is the cell orientation. Worker cells are horizontal, queens are vertical. That's the only difference, at least at the beginning. Also, the larval food is different after the first 2 days. The queen always gets fed royal jelly. Worker brood starts out on royal jelly for a couple of days, and then that transitions to, let's just call it worker jelly, and actually it ends up being some honey and pollen probably later when the larva is maturing. The best queens are made under the swarming impulse. And queen mates with multiple drones. That's called polyandry. That provides diversity in the colony. That's very important for the colony's health and productivity. And I make the analogy to us, people. If we were all very good at finance, I'm not sure we would be much of a society. If we were all good carpenters, right? We'd have some beautiful carpentry work, but we might not be able to eat. If we're all great farmers, okay, but there's some other things we should be able to do too. So if you have this diversity, because of the queen mating with multiple drones, some of the drones are going to have the genetics to be very good at for example, being hygienic is a good example, right? Some of the genetics, if a pupa has a disease or is under some kind of health stress, it'll emit pheromones. And there's some bees that are much more in tune or can smell sense those pheromones much better than other bees. Those other bees might be great foragers. They may make a lot of honey, or they may be great pollen connectors or great propolis collectors. But you want to have some bees in there that are hygienic, that are cleaning out pupa that are under stress because of some kind of disease. Final point, drone rearing is an important part of queen rearing. You need, it's the queen's the female part of the superorganism, the drone's the male part of the superorganism. And drones are, I'll talk about drones a little bit more in their importance.
Your clicker's broken.
I think I'm going too slow. She's telling me to hurry up. There we go, okay. So development of queens and drones, some people may argue that this timing is a little bit off, but a queen, all of them are pretty much 3 days. A queen's definitely 3 days. It's in a larval stage. It says 9. Some people would say 8.5. Pupa for up to 15, and then on day 16 it emerges as a queen. I got to tell you, some of my lines probably emerge more like on day 15. It depends on temperature, depends on genetics. Same with the workers, it's a little bit of variability there. So queens are ready to mate about 5 days after emerging. In other words, on day 21. Drones, on the other hand, are ready to mate 2 weeks after emerging, day 38. Stay on this slide just for a little bit. Sorry. But so rearing drones needs to start way before queen rearing. 17 days is what I try to do. That's a common number. Even before is a little bit better. So what's happening to the drones while they're during this 2-week period? Well, it's kind of funny. Sometimes I see drones on the outside of the frames just kind of hanging around, and I'll say, "Come on, boys, you need to go out and get your job done, right?" Well, they're really preparing to mate with the queen. And that preparation, part of it is the wing muscles and so forth, but it's really internal development of the shade. Yeah, no, they're still fuzzy.
Checking out the wardrobe.
Really, they're being fed by the colony. They're being nourished by the colony, and that nourishment's very important. They're really, whenever they emerge, they already have all the sperm they're going to have. But now their mucus glands are developing, and that mucus is very important for delivering the sperm to the queen. But also, it's very important once that sperm and mucus have been delivered to the queen, that mucus also helps transport the sperm to the spermatheca in the queen. And I'm loosely calling mucus, there's a lot of fluids there, but part of those fluids also help nourish and sustain the sperm and the spermatheca. That's the sperm and the spermatheca might live maybe up to 5 years, 2 years might be more typical. So some of the elements in that mucus are antioxidants and so forth too that help preserve that sperm, to help that sperm live for years in the spermatheca. The more care that the drones get, the more healthy that sperm's going to be, the better queen you're going to have. She can go out and mate with a drone that isn't healthy, and she may be perfectly good herself, but the sperm contributed by that drone or multiple drones isn't going to do her a whole lot of good. All right. So let's talk about queen rearing methods. And there's a bunch of non-grafting, and I'll talk about the Doolittle method here, just comparison as well. So with non-grafting, we'll take a quick look at swarm cells. I have alley method here, which is kind of interesting because of the time frame it was. Hopkins cell punching and notching we'll look at. We'll look at the Miller method and the Genter and Nycott methods. Let me just, how many people are familiar with any of these methods here? A few, yeah. Which ones are you familiar with?
I've done Miller and Nico and Allen. Or swarm cells, but.
Yeah.
That's the only one.
Okay. Yeah, we've all done swarm cells, whether we wanted to or not. Okay. Doolittle is the grafting method then. Okay, so swarm cells, non-grafting. This is really kind of the way I started raising queens. This is more like, 10 years ago kind of thing. I'd find a frame with swarm cells on it like this, and I'd take that frame and put it in a nuke, and maybe with another frame of bees and brood, some resources, pollen and nectar, and let those cells emerge. One of those queens that emerged first, kill the other queens. She would go out and get mated and, have another colony. That works most of the time. Let me call it 80% of the time. Could be anywhere between 50 and 100, right? But because a couple things got to happen. First of all, just by me moving these cells around, I could have damaged them. So that's not going to work. Sometimes the nukes really can't take care of the cells. So the queens die in these cells. They may get cold or they may get too hot. And so that's not going to work. Sometimes a queen does emerge out, kills the other queens, okay. But then something happens to that queen. She may go out the mating flight. And I've got tree swallows in one yard that are just flying around collecting bees all day long. And I'm sure they're collecting a few queens. But, amazingly, I'm going to say 80% of the time the queen goes out and she makes it back. But, if I talk about you multiply 80% by 80% by 80% and you get 50% after a while of success. Let me talk, swarm cells are typically at the edge of the brood on the bottom like this. You typically see them in April, May, and June. Supersedure cells, they're usually only one or two, and they're more typically on the brood frame. Emergency cells are always on the brood comb. Let's talk about that just a little bit. Swarm cells typically on the periphery of the brood, but not always. Frequently I'll see swarm cells on the bottom, I'll see them on the brood as well. So just because you've got a cell that's in the center of the brood doesn't mean it's a supersedure cell. It could be a swarm cell. The emergency cells are always on the brood comb because now the colony's gone queenless for some reason. The colony's in an emergency mode. They'll take a young larva, not necessarily the youngest larva, but one that is young enough, and they'll start raising that. Typically they'll raise more than one, and it could be multiple, just in case kind of thing. And these emergency cells are often hard to see, at least initially, because what they do is they start feeding a larva, filling that cell up with rural jelly to push that larva out and then to make it vertical. Again, they're taking a larva that's in a horizontal cell and making it vertical to make a queen. It's very difficult to find all the emergency cells. A lot of times people will dequeen a colony, like 24 hours or more, to put a new queen in. In an hour, those bees are already starting to build emergency cells. You're not going to see it, but they've started. You come back in 24 hours, you're still not going to see it because the larva is very, very small, and there's nothing really to see except that maybe a couple of the cells have more rural jelly in it. And so then they try to introduce a queen, and the colony's like, well, we're already started a queen. We don't want that one. And introduction becomes more difficult. I advocate, that you really only need to dequeen a colony maybe an hour before you put the new queen in, or even better yet, some people may make fun of me for this, but Grant Stiles told me that what a lot of commercial people do is they find the old queen and smash her head against one side of the cage, smash her abdomen against the other side of the cage, and put that right back in, and that's been highly successful for me. And I think the reason that is because old queen's mandibular pheromones are on the cage on the one side, and a lot of our other pheromone bouquet is on the cage on the other side. While the bees are cleaning up that mess, they're transitioning from the pheromones from the old queen to the new queen pretty quickly. That's the way I introduce queens, and I think I've been more successful that way than any other way.
And you do it an hour before?
No, I find the old queen and I introduce her to the new queen. Yeah, and it's, you know, and if you that way I don't need to come back, you know. It's just,
Oh, so it's laziness is what we're saying.
Yeah.
I don't
Now-
remember seeing that on the first slide.
So, you know, and a lot of, so now beekeepers will, you know, say the colony swarmed. So now they don't want to wait for another queen to be raised. So they'll cut off all these swarm cells and try to introduce a new queen. Would that work well in this frame? Suppose this is the only frame. Landy says no. Why?
No, because you probably, I mean, it looks like some of those may have emerged.
Well, I'm not saying that. Let's say they did emerge. There's another swarm cell up here that
Yeah.
you might have missed. And there's another one under this cluster of bees over here. And there's a one over here in the edge of the comb that even if the bees weren't there, you couldn't see.
You know-
Point is that if beekeepers, including myself, that try to remove all the swarm cells, invariably miss one or more, and introducing a new queen with swarm cells often fails.
And even if only one has emerged, you've got a virgin in there
Oh, yeah.
somewhere, you're probably not going to find her.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they're really hard to find.
Oh, I can find her. That's after I put a queen excluder on, shake
Yeah,
these
right.
down.
I think one thing a lot of people don't realize is that the difference between swarm cells and supersedure cells isn't where the cell is.
Correct.
It's the number of
Yeah,
cells.
yeah, exactly.
That's really the
Yeah.
biggest difference.
And this cell up here, I don't know if you noticed or not, some people might call that a supersedure cell just because of its position, right? But it's a swarm cell because you got all the, to Landy's point, you see all these others here. This is a swarm cell too. All right. Thanks for being patient, Pat.
John, when you see a hive that has gone through this swarm cell creation process, and you're seeing all these swarms, and there's difficulty in finding all of them and making sure that they end up with some kind of mated queen, does it mean that maybe the best thing to do is treat these swarm cells as
Can you go back one?
harvest for that
So-
hive that season?
Ask the question again, sorry.
Might it be best for us backyard beekeeper folks to, when we see a hive like this, understanding the difficulty in making sure that this thing ends up with a mated queen, maybe we should just treat these swarm cells as the harvest and just break them up into little
Yeah.
mating units.
Excellent point, yeah. Definitely. So,
Resource.
you know, there's probably other frames in the colony that look similar to this, maybe not as many cells. And I think if it was me, I would be doing two things. I would be cutting out and eliminating, killing as many of these swarm cells that I can find, except two of the best looking ones. And I would also find another frame that has similar swarm cells on, and again, eliminate as many as I can, except the two best ones. And then, like you said, put that in a nuke. I'd find another frame of brood and bees to put in that nuke. Find a frame of honey, find a frame of pollen, and a fifth frame of something else. 2 frames of brood and bees, two swarm cells. Maybe there's another fourth that you missed, but that's okay. Cut out the rest except the best 2 in the other colony. And the reason you're doing that is because the bees will actually protect some of these swarm cells. You could have a queen emerging from here, and she want to try to go and kill these others, but the bees will keep that queen away from a couple of those queen cells. They'll protect the virgins in there. They'll hold the queens in there for days because they want to make sure that this queen comes back mated. But in the meantime, the colony could be overrun with virgins if you don't cut them out, and you'll have after swarm after after swarm after after swarm. And so, you know, people talking about their colonies swarming themselves to death, well, they'll just keep going out with these virgins. And it's not unusual to have 3, 4, 5 queens in a small after swarm. Now, it's kind of interesting because I'm on a little tangent here, but you know, you'll have, let's say, 3 queens in this after swarm, 3 virgins, and they'll coexist in that swarm. They get to the new hive, whatever that is, the hollow tree, your swarm box, or whatever. Then they'll sort themselves out. You'll end up with 1 virgin. Now, I know this because I've caught after swarms, right? Find the queen, put her in a cage. They killed that queen. And come back, and I'm thinking they're queenless now. Come back, there's another queen in there. So it's pretty interesting, you know, what the superorganism does. Anyway, I'll get back to the presentation, sorry.
2 seconds question.
Yeah.
I know that there are queen cups that aren't necessarily like swarm cells.
Yes.
Can you talk about differentiating between the 2?
Well,
When you're looking at it.
yeah. So a cup, the bees will make cups all the time. My way of thinking about it is there's bees that are just running around saying, you know, I'm going to build a queen cup today. And this looks like a good place, and they'll build a queen cup. Now, some of this is instinctual, right? Because they want to build queen cups because they're coming into swarm season. But that's it. They're done with their job. So the cup is just there. And I can go one day and pull it out, and the next day I come back and I build some other cup some other place. Now, the queen laying eggs, she's just an egg-laying machine. She's cranking out, let me use a round number, 1,440. There's 1,440 minutes in a day. A queen will lay between typically maybe 1,500 to 2,000. But that means she's laying an egg a minute, kind of thing. And so these eggs are coming from her ovaries down her oviduals and to the end of her abdomen where she's able to deposit it. So if you could kind of picture yourself as a queen, and I've got an egg, I got to find some place to lay it. I got an egg, I got to find some place to lay it. Ooh, here's a big wide cell, it's a drone cell, lays a drone egg. Ooh, here's a worker cell, narrow cell, lays a worker egg. And running around, can't find any other cells. Oh, here's a queen cup, and lays an egg in a queen cup. And she knows that this is vertical, it's big enough, and it's bigger than a drone. And she still fertilizes it and lays a fertilized egg in that queen cup. So the idea that a queen intentionally lays eggs in a queen cup doesn't make sense to me. Whenever I watch queens on a frame, it's a random walk. They're just walking around trying to find some place that's ready for that egg to be received. It's the nurse bees that really prepare that queen cup to get it ready for the queen to lay in there. The queen just happens to find it. So the queen cup is empty, no egg. A queen cell starts by being polished by the nurse bees, prepared by the nurse bees. Eventually the queen happens on that queen cup, lays an egg, now it's a cell. As soon as it's a cell, the bees pay a lot more attention to that cup, including feeding it. Does that make sense, Landy? No. Sorry. I can have a talk later on.
Because, like, what if they don't want to raise queens?
They'll consume that egg.
Then the workers will get rid of it, is what
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
saying.
yeah,
But the
yeah.
queen will just randomly lay in there?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. She doesn't have a GPS. She says, oh, there's a queen cup over here. There's a queen cup over here. No, not from my observations. All right. That's enough on that slide. Sorry. So manipulating eggs or larvae in cells, this is another way. So basically here, it's cutting out cells or modifying the cells so that instead of them being horizontal, they're vertical now. And you place the cells in a queenless colony. So basically 2 steps. Take horizontal cells, make them vertical, put it in a queenless colony. Next slide. So Landy said she did the alley method. That's great. How did this work for you? What I find fascinating about this is that, you know, Henry Alley came up with this, 140 some years ago. And, you know, and on the internet, you hear people talking about like they just invented this kind of thing, but there's different techniques. But the alley method is basically you find a section of comb with the right age larva, you cut out that section of comb, and then you attach it to the bottom of another section of comb, maybe with some hot wax, and then you basically eliminate every second and third larva and leave one larva, eliminate second and third, leave another larva, and that makes enough space for the cells to be built. So this is a quick way to make, you know, half a dozen queen cells. Then you can easily take these queen cells off of here once they're capped and put them into another colony for them to raise a queen. So the alley method is probably one of the earliest methods like this. Now, next slide is all variations on this. The Hopkins is pretty straightforward. Basically, you just take a frame of brood, with worker brood, you know, it's in a hive like this, lay it flat. Now those cells are all vertical. And after a few days, you have all these queen cells on the bottom. And again, this is a queenless colony. So, you know, it's easy to do. And yeah, I'm not quite sure what you do with all these queen cells, but, you know, so you've got a queenless colony here. There's a little bit, you put a little bit of a shim to hold this up off the other brood frames, of course. And then you have these queen cells. And then you can cut these off of here and put them into other colonies or mating nukes or whatever to raise. So not a...
John, if you cut a cell,
Yeah.
an existing cell out, a mature cell,
Right.
and you want to put it somewhere else,
Right.
can you talk about how you protect that cell and how you handle that cell?
No,
You have a little gizmo?
I don't have a gizmo.
You do a gizmo?
I have a, I mean, I don't cut cells that much, but I just basically use a knife. And I got to tell you, you know, you can do this on wax foundation. It's really difficult to do it on plastic foundation. You basically have to clear everything out around it and then just kind of with your knife go underneath. And oftentimes you'll still cut through the top of the cell and you'll see rural jelly there. But to Landy's point, these cells are very delicate. When they're first capped, they're probably not as delicate as whenever they're just almost ready to emerge. Because when they're first capped, it's still a larva in that cell. That larva is moving around. It's actually still consuming some of the rural jelly that's left in that cell. It's then starting to spin a cocoon, getting its head pointed down, and then it's metamorphosizing into the adult that it will become. And just at the end of that stage is when it's developing its wings, and you can really injure a queen's wings by handling it rough. You know, 13, 14, 15 days, or like a couple days before its emergence. So again, the idea here is you're taking horizontal cells, making them vertical, putting them in a queenless colony, they raise queens. So the cell punching is kind of interesting. There's variations on this. So here, this cell puncher, you can see it around the cell. Now this would have young larvae in it, very young larvae. This cell puncher is the same size as this JZBZ cup, and you punch out the cell and you attach it to this bar, and then so that's a horizontal cell that then becomes vertical, and they'll raise a queen. So you know, it's a couple tools here. You know, you have this person made up this cell punch, but there's all kinds of cell punches out there that are basically like this. And again, you're just really getting a very young larva and cutting it out of the frame, making it vertical. And it's really kind of like the alley method, only it's one cell at a time. Then notching is kind of like that, only you're leaving the cells as horizontal, but you're taking the bottom away. And to the bees, that looks like a vertical cell now, apparently. I haven't talked to too many bees about this, but what they'll do is, again, you pretty much you see these young larvae here, so you may want to eliminate a couple of these, like keep this larva, eliminate this one and this one, keep this one, and so forth. Here's the larva of the right age down here. And the bees now see that horizontal cell as vertical because there's no bottom on it, and they'll raise a queen. So, you know, Randy Oliver talks about this in one of his articles. I think he says it costs 2 cents each to raise these queens this way. I don't think he has all his costs in there, but Queens for Pennies, I think, is the title of his article. But it's notching, and a lot of people do notching. And, you know, some people will be out working colonies, you know, 20, 40 colonies, come across a colony that looks hopelessly queenless. They'll pull a frame of brood out of another colony, notch some of it so the bees will start raising brood. And apparently that works sometimes. I haven't done a whole lot of this. Next slide. The Miller method. A lot of people in New Jersey have done the Miller method. I have not. It's kind of complicated, but the idea is that you have a frame and you put strips of foundation that are triangular shaped like this. The bees will start drawing it out. The queen lays eggs in it, and then you trim back some of the comb that's been drawn out to the right age larva, put it back in, and the bees will raise cells here. You can see that this is probably the queen started laying over here first. Is that a fair description, Landy? Because I haven't done it.
Bob Cole demonstrated this at an EAS
okay.
15,
Yeah.
17 years ago.
What's that?
It does work pretty well.
Does it? Okay.
Is that Grant?
Yep.
So again, you pull these queen cells off carefully and put them into colonies. Next slide. So a lot of people like the Genter or Nyko system because the perception is that pretty easy to use, but there's a lot of stuff you need for this too. But basically the idea, again, is the queen lays an egg in a horizontal cell, and you then take that cell and put it vertically. So these are the little cells here that are basically the size of worker cells. You put these in this rack here or this rack here, confine the queen to this for a few days, and I don't know if you can see it on the back, but there's eggs in here. Then you pull out these cells, you put it in these other devices here so you can have them vertical in this frame and put that in the queenless colony, and they raise queens. So you're doing everything like the grafting, except you're not grafting. So if you're limited with eyesight or whatever, it might make sense. I haven't done this. It seems complicated and not reliable to me, and I don't know if anybody has had a great amount of success with it, but
I did it. It's a pain in the neck.
yeah, that was my take on it too.
It's easier to graft.
I would agree with that. So having said that, next slide is the Doolittle method. And a lot of people are afraid of this because it's grafting. And I've talked, as Landy said, I've talked a lot more about this. But I've got to agree with what Gilbert has said here, Gilbert Doolittle. It's practical. It's a method by which the best of queen bees are reared in perfect accord with nature's way. I totally agree with that. And I also agree it's for the amateur, the backyard beekeeper, and the veteran, the commercial beekeeper. This was published back in 1901, 120 years ago, and people were still, if you read this, people are still doing pretty much exactly like he describes it here. This is a free public, it's online, you can look this up and get it. I do find it to be a dependable method, more dependable than any of the other methods I just showed you. It can be scheduled. I can pick the day that I want to go out and graft, but then I'm on that schedule. With the other methods, you're often at the mercy of, if the bees are going to raise queens today or tomorrow or next week kind of thing. I think that it produces the highest quality queens. A lot of the other methods we showed, where the queens were being made under emergency conditions, and the emergency queens are okay, but they're not the highest quality. It does require some special equipment and skill, but it requires less equipment and skill than the Nyko or Genter method, in my humble opinion. So anyway, so I wanted to be complete in all the queen rearing options out there, and even for the backyard beekeeper, I would consider grafting to be an option, even if you wanted to have graft 3 queens. You know, you could do that. It'd be pretty quick and easy to graft 3 or 4 queens into cups and then put them in a colony. Probably a little quicker than some of those other methods that I just described, right? Okay. So if you're going to raise queens, no matter what the method, nutrition is very, very important. You know, beekeepers do talk about nutrition, but I don't think it gets the press that it should. And drones don't get the press that they should either. I'm not saying that because I'm a male, but drones are very, very important. I talked about the importance of drones before. They need to be fed with plenty of rural jelly several days after emergence. Again, this is so that they can develop. The sperm has been developed for the most part, but they need to develop their mucus glands, which are important for the long-term viability of that queen, the sperm in the queen. The queen cells, to raise good queens, they must be overfed rural jelly for the best quality queens. We'll see another picture here in a little bit. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Queens also need to be, my term, fattened up after emergence from the nukes. You know, they emerge, they got to go out and fly, they got to get mated. But then they're just cranking out egg after egg. That takes a lot of high quality nutrition for the queen to be able to do that. If she doesn't get enough good nutrition whenever she first emerges, she's not going to be a quality queen. You could have started out with the best genetics, but if she's not really built up as soon as she starts emerging, when she emerges, she's ready to eat. And she'll find honey herself if there's nobody to feed her, but she's much better off if there's young nurse bees there to feed her rural jelly right away. Queens mated in protein-hungry nukes, or those lacking young nurse bees, they may fail prematurely. It's been, you know, a few studies have indicated that. It makes sense to me. You got to have good nukes. Well, it wouldn't be a beekeeping meeting without talking about mites and also the viruses that they bring along. So the colonies must have very low mite levels. I mean, that's true in general, but if you're going to raise queens, that's especially true. The mites are stressful on colonies. You need to minimize that stress. There's a lot of viruses. You know, every time I read a new paper, there's another virus or two that shows up in the paper. I remember, I think it was about this time last year, maybe 2 years ago, there was like 21 viruses that were identified. You know, we're 30-something now, kind of thing. And okay, some of these are strains of the same virus, right? But some are more virulent than others. So the colonies must be low in mites. That includes the colony where you're getting the queen is, where you're getting your larva from. Definitely true in the drone colonies. It's colonies donating the nurse bees to the cell starters, and we'll look at the cell starters in a little bit. The cell finishers, same thing. And your mating nukes need to be, you know, you can't have mite-riddled colonies and raise good queens. I used to use cloak boards. Tim Schuler gave me my first cloak board a few years ago. So the cloak board is a method of getting cells started and then finished. So you basically have a queen right colony under the cloak board. This piece here is the cloak board. This sheet would be called the board. It happens to be a sheet metal sheet in this model. And then you have another box above it, 10 frames full of bees, and you put the cells in the center here. So, you know, usually you have an opening in the center where you'd put your cells, and then you'd have pollen on each side of that. Then you'd have honey on that, and maybe a mix of other resources beyond that. After 2 days, the cells are pretty well started, and then you can remove the cloak board. The theory here is that better cells are raised above a queen-right colony. I don't use this anymore. I just have queenless colonies that I use, and I keep well populated with young nurse bees. So it's kind of the same principle, but a little less complicated. But if I was starting to raise queens again, I'd highly suggest using a cloak board. There's a couple other advantages of cloak board. This colony underneath keeps the cells in this colony up here much more temperature stable. Again, very important for raising queens. And
Like a Snell Grove board.
a Snell Grove board, well, that's different completely. But you know, that Snell Grove board would have screen in it, so the bees couldn't go back and forth between it like this. So
Why did you stop using the cloak board?
I found that, you know, so I was using the cloak board, and I had it pretty well packed up with bees, and I think you said I was lazy before. That might. Yeah, I really found that I was raising good queens without removing this board. I just had them packed up with bees. And the thing is, I would pull a lot of the bees out of the bottom here and bring up here, at least temporarily, and other bees. So I'd have this top box packed full of bees, and then I'd lose part of them to this colony down here. I could have more bees and nurse bees up here just by leaving this board in. So now I have, actually I have a double deep. I use double deeps, just packed full of bees. And every week I put.
A single wouldn't be enough bees.
Well, a single would be. I could get enough bees in a single. You'll see in a second. But I keep putting young nurse bees. I keep putting frames of brood in that double deep, and I usually put it in the bottom. So
How often do you work them?
twice a week typically, because I'm putting cells in one day and I'm taking out cells another day. But I think I have, let's see, 1, 2, 3. I've got 3 or 4 queen excluders on those boxes, because I got one on the bottom. I don't want a virgin queen flying in the bottom. I got a queen excluder between them, because I put the frames of brood in the bottom, just in case something happens. And I've been pretty good this year, but there's been exceptions where I've had to find virgins. And then I really try to prevent virgins from flying in from someplace with the queen excluders. So again, cloak board, queen-right colony on the bottom, put the cloak board in, pack this top box full of bees. After 2 days, pull the cloak board out. And you know, if you're starting in the backyard, I'd suggest doing this. And it does make good queens. Next slide. So this is an actual picture of a pollen frame that's very typical of what I'd use. It's a frame that's probably 2/3, 3/4 full of pollen, maybe a little bit of honey and nectar on it, but mostly packed up with pollen. I pull this from another hive that's really kind of stored this on the side of its brood nest, but they've got plenty, so I take it out and I usually have 2 or more frames, that's good, of pollen in there, again, on each side. And then here's the hive set up with the cloak board. This is a queen-right colony down here. Here's the entrance to that queen-right colony. That entrance used to be around the front. Earlier maybe an hour before, I picked up that bottom board, moved it so the entrance is in the rear. The bees are out foraging now. We'll try to come back in the entrance, but the only entrance there is on the front of this cloak board, and they'll continue to pack more bees into this colony. So, and I'm getting these bees from other hives. What's that?
I'll give it to you. It's enough bees.
So I pulled some of the bees from the bottom here typically, but I'm pulling most of the bees. If any have been to my yard, I've got a bunch of nukes set up, and I'm pulling frames of bees and brood out of that nuke, I'll put a queen excluder on top of here and then another box, and I'll just shake it down through there. The queen excluder is just to be absolutely sure I'm not chasing a queen into there. You know, so that's barely enough bees. But you know, the colonies are packed, and they just really make nice nice cells.
John,
Yeah.
I think this is a point that's really worth emphasizing.
Good.
The two keys, right, for making really good quality queens are number one, nutrition, and number two, lots of bees.
So I meant to bring my swarm box for raising queen.
That's what I use, is the swarm box.
Yeah, so if you don't want to build one like this with like 10 frames and all these bees, you can build half of one. And as long as you don't put more, I'm going to say more than 10 cells in there, maybe 15, they'll probably be fine. People oftentimes put more like 45, but again, it's the bee to cell ratio that produces good queens. And if a swarm box is just a 5-frame nuke, it's got plenty of ventilation on the bottom because there's a lot of bees in there and they get packed in, and it's queenless. And so you put a frame or two of pollen and nectar in, and you put another frame of other resources in, plenty of bees. Again, you're getting bees from other colonies and shaking them in there, so that if you can picture, it'd be like half of this. And now you've got a queenless nuke that's packed full of bees, and you can put your cells in there, or the young larvae that you want to make cells from, and they'll make some pretty nice cells that way. Yeah, they're closed. Yeah,
the bees can't fly.
Yeah.
The entrance is closed.
Yeah, you know, here in this hive, the bees can fly, but most of them are young nurse bees. They don't want to fly. They just stay there. And I don't close this one in because there's so many bees here. They need to get out. And whenever I'm finished with this and I close it up, they'll be hanging on the outside. They're not flying back to their other colonies because of the young nurse bees. Again, they don't know where they came from. All I know is they're there now, kind of thing. So this is a finished cell. And you know, if it was a swarm cell, it would look like this, except it wouldn't have the plastic top on it. A lot of people think the size is important, both how long the cell is and how big around it is. And I'd agree that that's important. But the most important thing I look for is this residual rural jelly in here. Now this is a cell that's got a mature pupa in here. It's getting ready to merge in a couple days. So that there was a larva, whenever this cell came out of the, was first capped, this was probably plugged full of rural jelly in here. As I said before, the larva is still moving around in this cell after it's capped. It's still consuming some of this rural jelly, again, trying to get as fat as it can. And this residual rural jelly left now, once it's in the pupa stage, is an indication that that larva has had plenty of nourishment. That's all that is. So I really, you know, whether there's a little or a lot, it doesn't really matter, but it matters that there's some left, because if there's none left, then that's a starving larva that was in there. And hit it one more time. It's a little movie. So let's see if it plays. I don't know if you can hear it, be able to hear it.
Now we won't be able to hear it.
What's that?
We won't be able
Okay. So I have to, is it going to play? Hit the return button, maybe that'll play it. There we go. All right, so this is a queen castle, and I use a lot of queen castles as mating nukes. It's divided into 4 sections. I populate them with a frame of brood, and then that's a frame of resources here. Again, I like to pack them up full of bees because they need to maintain that temperature in that mating nuke. It's very, very important for the queen. So getting a queen cell here now, and I'm saying on the video that just handle the queen cell very gently. Be careful not to injure the bottom of the cell here. And it's in a JZBZ cup, so it's pretty easy, just handled by the plastic. And then I insert the cell on a frame of brood. I find it doesn't really matter whether it's open brood or cap brood or mixed brood, as long as there's enough bees there that can care for the cell and care for the rest of the brood. And I'm just saying, make sure that it's the bees have access to the bottom of the cell. And then it goes back into the queen castle. So the queen castles work pretty well for me. I'll get 3 out of 4, 4 out of 4 typically with the cells. So if you're going to raise queens in a backyard, don't have a lot of space and so forth, queen castles is definitely an option for you. This happens to be a 4-section. Others make 3-section queen castles.
Quick question, John.
Yes.
About these queen castle concepts and the very small mating nuke concept, like
You're right.
2 or 3 frames. Just trying to understand the purpose of that, and I wanted to throw out my guess here. So we can
Sure.
say, is it really just about like risk management? You don't want to invest too many resources until you're sure that a queen comes back and is a laying queen before,
Yeah.
and then you can give more
Yeah.
frames to it.
Yeah, it's. I'm going to say it's more resource management.
Resource.
Yeah, because in the spring, you could have a lot of colonies that are producing brood. I mean, this frame of brood probably came. It's summertime now, so that brood that you see on there is from the previous queen, by the way. So I took her out and put this cell in. But whenever I'm getting started in the spring, I'm pulling frames of brood out of regular honey production colonies. And there's only so much of that to go around. And everybody wants queens in the spring, right? So I'm trying to make as many queens as I can with as resources that I have. I find, and so queen castles work for me, and I have a lot of 5-frame nukes that I divide in half, and I put 2 frames on each side. Again, 2 deep frames. That works for me because I'm pulling deep frames out of my regular production colonies. So it's no special equipment for this. I'm just, pulling resources, brood or nectar, larva, or nectar, pollen, and so forth out of other colonies. So I can put together mating queen castles that way. And as the spring goes on, I'm going to have more and more brood, more nectar, more pollen, and so forth that I can keep building. So that's what works for me. A commercial queen rearer, they're just going to go through the colony shaking bees and getting a whole bunch of bees, and then they want to put those resources in small mating nukes, those maybe small styrofoam nukes, and that's okay under the right conditions. I got to tell you, here in northern New Jersey, I mean, I use them, and I use them successfully, but the window that I can use them in is pretty small. If it's in the early spring, it's too cold, there's not enough bees in there to maintain the temperature. We're kind of coming to the end whenever I can use those small mating nukes. As a matter of fact, the queens are in those small mating nukes. That's going to be the last round that I'm going to use them, because we're coming on the dearth now. There's not many bees in there. They're the first ones to get robbed out.
And there's small hive beetles issues.
I've had some small hive beetle issues, but they've been in the regular size mating nukes, not the small ones. But it could be either one.
Great, thanks for that answer. Did I understand correctly, though, what you were saying about your own setup is that once you have queens already laying and proving themselves, and you've removed them, you essentially have a self-sustaining place
Yeah,
to prove out new queens.
correct. Yeah. So,
You don't have to keep pulling out frames from production hives.
So right now, this time of the year, I'm not pulling any out of the production hives. As a matter of fact, I mean, the production hives are starting to, they've gone from, trying to get 12 frames of brood now, they're coming back down. That comes back to locally adapted, actually. They're self-sustaining now. And so like this queen castle here is divided up into 4 sections. I'll pull a queen out of one section, and I'll pull out the divider, and so now it'll be, those two will become one. I'll put another frame in typically in that space, and that queen castle now will just have 2 queens in it instead of 4, and I'll overwinter it that way. I'll overwinter it above another strong colony. That seems to work pretty well. So we're kind of off on a tangent there, but I think it'll all tie together here in the end too. So queen castle is definitely a nice option for raising queens. If you have 1 queen castle, you can keep raising 4 queens all summer long. And you don't have really the only special equipment's a queen castle because it's not special sized frames like in a mini mating nuke or something like that. To get my mini mating nuke started, I take those frames and I put them in a full-size frame, I put them in a strong colony, and I actually get a queen to lay on those mini mating nuke frames. So when I put a queen cell in, there's already bees and brood in there. If I don't do that, I can start them earlier that way than if I just let them start their own.
Could I reuse existing nuke equipment and just use empty frames as space, just to fill in the space on the sides? Set 2 or 3 real frames in the middle.
Yeah, you pretty much, you might be able to get away with 4 frames of comb and a frame of foundation, but yeah, you need frames of food in there for them, pollen and honey. You need 2 frames of brood typically to be successful. So 2 frames of brood, 2 frames of resources, and then the 5th frame can be anything, foundation, open comb, or whatever. But, you know, as Landy and I both saying, nutrition's very important, so you need to make sure that they're fed, either with what's in the colony or you're feeding themselves. Next slide. What?
It's 8:30.
Yeah. So here's a cell on a frame, just placed, saw that in the movie. Next slide. So here's another little movie. I never get tired of watching this. Let's see if it runs. So this is a colony I was inspecting. I heard this queen piping. There's probably another queen in here. This might have been actually a case where the bees were holding this queen in the cell, and I interrupted that process. So I knew she was in there. But look how the queen's in there. This is upside down now. I'm holding the frame upside down. Look how the queen has chewed like a circular pattern. There she comes. And see how it's hinged. It's almost like a little trap door. So that's the end of the movie. Next slide. I'm going to move pretty quickly now. So that's the emerged cell there. Again, look how nice and neat that bottom opening is. You know, when I go through the mating nukes, I look for that. If I see that, I know the queen emerged. I'm always looking at the cells to make sure that they've emerged. If they didn't emerge, then I check them to see why. Earlier in the spring, it's oftentimes the pupas just got cold. I'm always looking for black queen cell virus. That's really what I don't want to have, and I haven't had it. Next slide. This little movie too, it's pretty quick. So my daughter took this and Instagrammed this, so she said inking queens here. But I mark all the queens. And this is a mini mating nuke here, 3 frames. She's going back in there. Once I see eggs, that's when I mark the queens. I don't really, some people mark virgins, but I wait till I see eggs and then I mark the queens. Next slide. So here's it's a proven queen. There's a lot of open brood around here, some cap brood here that I can see it's worker brood. Looks like a pretty nice queen. There's nice retinue around here. So whenever I see this worker brood, that means she's proven. Pretty decent pattern there. Next slide, there we go. So introducing a mated queen. Need to make sure there's no other queen or queen cells in the colony. If there's another queen or queen cells in there, it's not going to be successful. Ideally, the colony's been queenless for 1 to 3 hours. I'm fine with an hour. The colony knows it's queenless in less than 20 minutes in my experience. And again, I'm handling queens a lot, so I can pull a queen out of a mating nuke. And I swear the queen is making some sound or some pheromone is telling the rest of the bees in that mating nuke that she's under stress. I mean, I see it all the time. So anyway, they know they're pretty quickly that they're queenless. The emergency cells start after a few hours. We talked about that. If there's no nectar flow, then feed the colony. Place the queen between in a cage between 2 frames of brood. The queen needs to pick up the colony's bouquet and so forth, and the colony needs to pick up the new queen's pheromones. I talked about your suggestion of smashing the head and the abdomen against the cage, and that works really well for me. Even though the colony's been queenless for a short time, a new queen in there, they still may start emergency cells. If there's emergency cells, that interrupts the queen introduction process. So I typically tell people to leave the cap on and then look for emergency cells and take the cap off. And after another 2 days, again, remove any emergency cells. Now they're going to be easier to see, and verify the queen's released. And then after another 2 to 5 days, the queen should be laying. Using nukes to introduce a queen. This is probably a good way to introduce a queen, especially if you raise this queen in this nuke, and it's you can pretty much just take this nuke and put it in the other colony.
My favorite way.
So it can be a 5-frame nuke, either a deep or a medium. 2 to 3 frames of cap brood, 2 to 3 frames of resources. That's typically the so you can introduce the queen in there. It's queenless, it's small, and then you can requeen a colony at any time. And this is a good way. If you've got this nuke sitting there with the queen and her support force, and now all of a sudden you need to requeen for whatever reason. Maybe you killed the queen, maybe something happened. You're ready to move that queen into the colony. Let's play this video. So this is a little queen bank I have in my house for people that want to pick up queens. I took all the queens out of here, and 20 minutes later I came back with more queens to put in here, and these bees are fanning. They're acting queenless. I mean, it's just amazing to me that that they know that quick that they're queenless.
It's a shame we don't have the audio.
Yeah, they're just
'Cause they're
buzzing.
very loud.
Yeah, and you can smell the Nasanov pheromone too whenever there's that many bees fanning. Next slide, maybe. So fall requeening. There's advantages to fall requeening. I heard this over at Man Lake a couple years ago. One of the presenters there said that the queens that are provided with nukes and packages, consider those starter queens that get the colony up and going for the summer and so forth. But then consider requeening in the fall. And why requeen in the fall, whether it's from nukes or packages or the queen that's been there since last year? You'll hear people talk about queens lasting for 3-5 years or whatever. It doesn't seem like that's true today, that's for sure, if it was ever true. I think a lot of times people really don't know how often the queens are replaced. And to that point, my own observations is that the colony likes to requeen itself in the fall. That's whenever you see most of the supersedures in a colony. Even if you think you have a great queen in a colony, oftentimes I'll see supersedures in the fall. And you'll see mother-daughter queens in the fall. The colony decided it needs a new queen to go into winter. The mother-daughter will coexist in the colony for a while, and then the mother will disappear at some point, and the daughter will be there and take that colony through the winter. Point is, it seems like, again, working with the bees, they like to requeen themselves in the fall. Even if they get some kind of sense that this queen is not going to take us through the winter as well as she could, let's supersede. If that supersedure works, we'll go with the new queen. If it doesn't, we still have the original mother queen there. So I think that it's in tune with the colony to requeen in the fall. Next, a couple animations there. So the best queens are really have been reared in June and late June up until about this point because there's plenty of drones out there. Nutrition's good. We've been on a nectar flow. They're well nourished. So they're the best queens. And a young, vigorous queen going into winter, she'll lay more brood in the fall, and she'll lay later into the fall. That results in a larger population in the hive, larger cluster. And some people would say, well, they consume more food. I don't really, they will consume more food, but it doesn't seem to be a problem from what I see. They don't use more food during the winter, that's for sure. And I know that because I keep the data on my hives with weighing and so forth. The new young vigorous queens start laying eggs a little bit earlier in the spring. They build a larger colony coming into the spring. And I think in that area, our area, this really helps because our nectar flows start kind of early. And so you'll be able to take advantage of that. And then, you know, fall queens are less likely to swarm the next year, but they'll still swarm. So don't assume they're not going to swarm. So speaking of that, I got a call today that, oh, I need 3 queens because my colony swarmed. Well, I talked myself out of sales again. Next slide. So I have this little spreadsheet. I put today's date in here just for conversation, but you know, I use a spreadsheet like this to keep track of queen rearing, and you know that the queen had the queen laid an egg in a queen cup, like we were talking about earlier, back in June 28th. July 2nd, a few days ago, it hatched, and today it's capped. Colonies typically swarm whenever that queen cell, the first queen cell's capped. Not always. Depends on the size of the colony, some too, but that's generally true. But if you see a colony swarm today, they're probably within a few days of this schedule. Next Wednesday, a week later, then on one day, the queen will emerge. But she'll need to stay in the colony for a couple days before she's able to fly. She may fly but not mate. She may also mate that day. She could be mating up to a week after that. And if she made it earlier, then she'll start laying eggs. But if she hasn't, it'll be a week later. So now, you know, now the colony swarmed back on July 6th, but it's really not going to be to the end of this month, or maybe the first of the next month, August, till you'll see eggs. In the meantime, you'll be looking at this colony and you'll see less and less brood. The cap brood will disappear because now it's more than 21 days. You might have some drone brood left, and people are really worried that colonies are queenless. But there's a queen in there someplace. You just can't find her. But if, you know, and colonies are pretty good. They'll requeen themselves, again, 80% of the time. Next slide. So overwintering nukes, we talked about this a little bit. I'll summarize it again. Overwintering nukes, a lot of people in this area are successful with 5/5 frames. And so now's a good time to start that. If you're raising a queen now, you can raise it in a nuke and then put another nuke box on top of it with 5 frames. Feed that nuke, fill those 5 frames up with sugar, water, honey, and get it ready for winter. So to make these nukes, it would be the equivalent of 3 5-frame nukes if it was mediums. Is that what you do, Landy? Or you use 2?
I do both.
Yeah.
Whatever, you know, whatever they.
If you want to be more
I'm
sure, I would say
successful.
3.
Yeah, but I'm successful with
Yeah.
2 also.
Okay.
Packed.
Yeah, packed, and also with a young, vigorous queen.
Yeah. And the top box is all capped honey.
Yeah. And so your target by late October, early November here in this area, it should be, again, packed, 8+ frames of bees. If it's medium, 12. Still should be a couple frames of brood in there if you have a young, vigorous queen. That young brood is the winter bees that are going to survive until late next spring. Those are, you know, there's a lot of winter bees already there that are older. and they may not survive all the way to next spring. The brood that's in the colony in November is going to merge, and that's really going to be the winter bees that are going to really take it through the beginning of the spring. So I think it's important to have that. 5+ frames of honey, 7 if it's in mediums. I also look for frames of pollen. A colony that survives the winter needs like a frame of pollen in the fall. Those young nurse bees will consume most of that during the fall. You won't see that in the spring, but they need to have that in the fall to make it through the winter in good health. And typically people pack the nukes together. I put 4 together, then I insulate the sides, I insulate the top. And I used to say top entrances, but I found that top entrances are optional, and certainly reduce the bottom entrance. Next slide. So there's 4 nukes packed together, 5 deeps over 5 deeps, 4 hives, and there's holes for the top entrance. Here's 14 5-frame nukes, and I don't recommend this, but this has worked for me for the most part. It's a little bit of a learning here too. The nukes on the top did fine. I lost a couple on the bottom, and it's all about heat. The nukes on the bottom kept the nukes on the top warm, but didn't have enough resources, honey, to, so unfortunately starved. So that's the first time I did this with 5-frame nukes, but, on this picture here, you can see thermocouples back here, so I'm monitoring the temperature so I can see what's going on. Next slide. So, top entrances, FLIR camera. A picture's worth 1,000 words. There's a significant amount of heat loss with a top entrance, no matter what hive you have. This is almost like a little chimney. Cold air is coming in the bottom, getting heated up by the cluster. The cluster's not trying to heat that area, but it's losing heat, just like we would even if we had a winter jacket on, we'd be losing heat. That heat goes out the top entrance. This cold air coming in here, it's dry air, right? Just like cold air coming in your house. It's low humidity. It's drying out this cluster too. They're getting very, very thirsty. So on the first day that it's warm enough to fly, they're out. They're trying to find any kind of water source they can, and they end up dying because they can't make it back. So I've run a lot of colonies without a top entrance, and they do just fine. Top entrances are not needed. As a matter of fact, it's probably more beneficial if you don't have a top entrance. The colony will lose less heat, it'll consume less honey, and it will not be thirsty, it will not be dehydrated. Next slide. All right, so summary slide. Verify there are plenty of mature drones. Select your mother colony based on, I don't have gentleness up here, but that would be my first selection criteria, but also honey production. Certainly you want a queen that's overwintered. If that overwintering that has selected a lot of good genetics for this area. Look for hygienic behavior, because that'll help with bee diseases, including chalk brood and American foul brood. Definitely want low mite counts, as we talked about before. I just check my colonies for nosema too. Not everybody does that. Set up the queen cell starter finisher and put the cells in. We talked about a couple different ways to do that. You might have just a 5-frame nuke packed with bees. You might use a cloak board with bees packed above it. And then verify queen emergence in the mating nuke, and then verify the queen's laying in 2 to 3 weeks. So with that, questions, and we're at 8:30. I didn't get to the queen myth busting, but we can do that real quick if you wanted. Okay, all right, let's go for it real quick. So the bees. I have the internet now for them, so they're watching reruns of Mythbusters, so they came up with the Queen editions here. So we got confirmed or we got busted, just like on the real Mythbusters. One more, there we go. And so we got two scenarios here. There's no commercial break in between. So a queen's race strain can be determined by her abdomen color and markings, right? Some people look at a queen and say, oh, that's an Italian queen, right? And the second one's a queen's quality can be determined by your brood laying pattern. Let's take the first one. Next slide. Queen's race or strain can be determined by our abdomen color and markings. So let's look at a couple. So this queen here, what do you think she is? You may have seen this slide before. How about this one? What's this one? Huh? What's this one? And how about this one? Huh? What about this one's kind of neat. Huh? Next slide. Here's the answers. Or at least this is what. So this one kind of looks like a carniolan. All right. This is Italian. She's kind of golden here. But then look at this one here. This is Italian and carniolan mixed. Could have fooled me. Here's another carniolan. Here's a Cordovian, which is kind of like we call these blondes. And here's a Russian over here. I had a guy call me today for he wanted to requeen Russian hives, by the way. He bought Russian queens, and I asked him why. But the Russian queens are very, very defensive. He's had enough of them. The Russian queen breeders, they really try to select for gentleness, but they're working on it, but it's not there yet. And I'm telling them that if your Russian queens are producing drones that are out mating with other people's bees out there, they're going to make those other queens have defensive genes. All right, next one. I'm sorry. So honeybee races here. This chart's been around for a while, right? And you can kind of see all the different colors here in Russian and these traits. And you start looking at these traits in honey collection, they all get 10s. I was surprised at that, right? Defensive behavior, okay, Africanized bees, they're pretty highly defensive, right? And then 1s for all the rest and 7 for a Russian. Maybe I'll buy that. But, as I look at this chart, the only pure strain on here is Buckfast, if it came from the University of Guelph, because they do island mating. The Russian bees are not pure because they're open mated. They try to control the mating. Africanized bees, they're Africanized because of the open mating. So they're all mixed together, and that's pretty good again too, because that's all the you've got genetics from, let's say, carniolans, you got genetics from Italian and maybe some others, kind of mixing together and self-selecting in a way to whatever survives the winter. And if you're doing some of that selection too, by selecting which queens you're going to raise new queens from, that's good. So you got this, let's say, set of genetics that's good for this area, and you're being successful. So can you tell honeybee breeds by the color? I'm going to call that one busted. All right, next one. A queen's quality can be determined by her brood laying pattern. So you see a frame of brood like this and you say, oh, that's a good queen. You see another frame of brood and there's hardly any, a frame that should be brood, there's hardly any brood on it, right? And so there's something wrong with that queen. So there's an interesting, there was a study done and they took pairs of colonies, 21 pairs of colonies. One set of these 21s had queens that the beekeeper thought was not performing well. The other set was that the queen was performing well. So the next season, they swapped queens in these colonies. And what they found was that the poor performing queens moved over to these other colonies. All of a sudden, they started performing well.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I sold an overwintered nuke to a friend, and to him, and he said one's doing fine, the other queen's not doing good. I see her walking around, but there's no brood, there's nothing there. And I thought, geez, that's unusual, because it overwintered, right? I mean, it's the overwintered nukes are like they're just ready to go. So I was thinking maybe disease, and I better go look at this. I looked at it and went down, and the colony really had no resources in it. Very little honey, no pollen. And the colony was starving. But I'd already brought down 2 frames of bees and brood and a new queen for him, so we put that in, and it's doing fine now. I brought that queen back, and I put her in a mating nuke with just 1 frame of brood and 1 frame of resources. And she's, if you go back once, that frame of brood, that's what it's not the same frame, but that's what she did after being in that colony for a couple weeks. So, go ahead now.
John, not to interrupt you there, but a lot of that has to do with population dynamics of the colony.
Yes.
Yeah, that.
To able to clean, to get the proper resources.
Yeah. You want to do this slide here for me, Grant? No, I'm with you. I'm with you. So the queen has potential, right? But the potential, as Grant's saying, is right on, right? It's the circumstances in the colony. She could have great genetics. The physiological conditions, some queens are not reared so well, so their ovaries really aren't as productive. And some queens could be great, but they're just not well mated. And then there's the actual egg laying ability. The number of nurse bees in a colony, the brood nest temperature, and whether or not they have good nutrition. So you could have a high potential queen, but if there's not very many nurse bees, and temperature is very important, and if you don't have enough bees, they're not going to be able to maintain brood nest temperature, and if they're starving, she's not going to be able to produce. Is this what you were saying, Grant?
Yeah.
Okay. And add anything if you want, that's for sure. So a queen's quality can be determined by her laying pattern. Well, a queen's actual performance is dependent on the colony and the hive conditions. A queen is only as good as her support force. Whenever somebody gets a queen from me, I tell them over and over again. What's her support force? It's young nurse bees. Healthy, well-nourished nurse bees are needed for queen productivity. If it's older bees, they're going to try, but they're not going to be as good as young nurse bees. Young nurse bees feed the queen so she can produce eggs. If there's not enough nurse bees there to produce royal jelly for her, she's not going to be able to produce eggs. The young nurse bees prepare cells for the queen to lay in. We talked about that a little bit. They prepare that cell. The queen checks the cell to see if it's ready, and I don't think we know what she's checking, but she checks. If the nurse bees haven't been there to prepare the cell, whether it's a worker cell or whatever, she's not going to lay an egg. The young nurse bees feed the brood. The queen can lay an egg, and if there's not enough nurse bees, the nurse bees will consume that egg. And then the nurse bees maintain a nest temperature and humidity. So, the queen can have great potential, but she's very dependent on so the pattern is just part of it, so I'm going to call that one busted too. All right. So, what kind of queen is this?
One of yours.
Huh?
One of your queens.
Hit it again.
John, reiterate that point about.
Oops.
Whoa.
You said it again, I didn't.
Okay, you did. Yeah. So this queen is American queen, locally adapted. So, sorry, Grant, what were you saying? Back one slide. Is that what you're saying?
No, I was going to add something to that dynamic.
Oh, okay. So people call me up and say they want Italian queen or Carniolan queen or whatever, and I said, geez, I only have American queens that are locally adapted. So, all right. So Grant, go ahead.
So in the spring, going back to that dynamic situation, we'll have a lot of colonies that are like only 2 frames of bees. Well, that thing will never get going. You just never got enough bees.
It needs a critical mass to get ahead, right?
So what we do with those is we combine 2 or 3 of them, just combine them. And that thing just takes off. Now one of those 3 queens, or 2 or 3 or whatever, is still there. So all of them were no good, supposedly.
Right.
But as soon as they get enough support forces, food coming in, they explode. A month later, we're splitting that thing back into 3-frame nukes. So it's got to get the growth to go in order to get to the right temperature and timing so it can go naturally on its weakened state.
And let me add to that too. This comes back to having a young, vigorous queen in that colony coming out of the winter. That younger young vigorous queen will have a bigger brood nest. I've seen this over and over again. An older queen will have a smaller cluster, and it'll have a smaller brood nest, and it'll take them longer to crank up and get going. A young vigorous queen that's, you know, a fall queen, she'll crank up very nicely, very quickly in the spring. I've made the mistake over and over again because I looked at a colony and thought the queen was doing a fantastic job in the fall. No need to replace her. In the spring, she's just kind of putting along, and the young vigorous queen right beside her is taking off. All right. I'll catch you later. I'll stick around for a little while if there's questions and so forth.